Welcome to Line Mountain Studio's 4th video tutorial. This tutorial we're going to be looking at drum rack. And now while looking at it, we're going to realize that it's similar in some ways to Impulse, which we've been learning about in the last 2 videos. Like Impulse, it's also a drum machine, and we can program it by drawing in beats or playing in beats using a piano MIDI keyboard. But it's also a bit different to Impulse because it's more flexible, and in that way it allows us to have lots more control over the sound. Alright, so let's open up Ableton and load a drum rack into our set. I'm using a PC at the moment, so I've got a little shortcut here on the desktop for me to open the program. Now I'm going to open a live set that already has an Impulse machine loaded, so that we can talk about the similarities and differences between Impulse and drum rack. So let's start with the similarities. Now, like Impulse, drum rack is a MIDI instrument, which means that we're going to have to create a new MIDI track here to load drum rack onto. So I'll just go to Create, and then MIDI track. And like Impulse, and really any of the tools that you're going to make music within Live, you drag and drop them from the device browser here on the left into the track that you want them in. So in this case, just look in Instruments by pressing on that little triangle, and all of your instruments will appear. Find drum rack and drag and drop it onto the MIDI track. And you can be sure it's worked when the title bar changes to say drum rack, and you can see it down the bottom. If you ever lose sight of it because you've clicked somewhere else, just click there on the title bar anytime you want to see it again. So even though it might look a little bit different from Impulse at first, it's still totally the same for loading the samples, in the sense that you just grab the samples from the left in your file browser and you drag them into the empty slots that are in the drum rack interface. So just find the samples that you want by navigating through these folders, clicking on them to preview them, and then when you find some that you like, drag and drop them into the empty slot area on the drum rack interface. Now you should be able to listen to your samples by launching them in this slot area here. So that seems to be working well. And now making beats in drum rack is actually identical to making beats in any other drum machine. You just double click on an empty slot somewhere in the drum rack MIDI track there, and then you can draw them in the clip information area below. So playing beats in using a MIDI piano keyboard is also really similar. Make sure that the arm set and recording button is red, so it's activating the keyboard input. Then press the metronome on because it's handy to play along in time. Then double click to create an empty clip. Press play and you can start playing them in. Note that in drum rack you'll generally be playing in that bottom octave of your keyboard. That's where the notes appear by default. So remember, in Impulse it was around the center octave. In drum rack it's always down the bottom. And now everything else to do with programming your beats is also identical, and that's including quantization. So I'll just select this mess that I made there with that last beat. I'm going to right click it and quantize. I can also change the length of them with the mouse and do other kind of editing, just like we've been doing in Impulse. So it looks like it's actually so similar that you can already get started with it only knowing what we've covered in the previous video tutorials. So now let's have a look at some of the differences. And in looking at these differences, we'll actually take a look at how it can be a little bit more powerful and therefore heaps more fun. So the first difference is the way in which you can control the sound of your samples. Remember in last tutorial we looked at how we could use the controls within Impulse to kind of tweak and improve or personalize the samples that we'd loaded in? Well, in drum rack it's kind of the same. You just need to double click on a sample slot area, and then you'll find an interface fairly similar unfold next to that drum rack pad area. So as well as a lot of extras, you'll find a few familiar things amongst these knobs. Things like volume, pan, transpose and filter. And there are also a whole lot of new knobs and buttons that are totally worth looking at. Now note that as you hover over them with your mouse, and that is place your mouse pointer over the top of each part of this interface, that little information window on the left will tell you a little bit about what it does. The second difference is that in Drum Rack you can isolate and apply effects onto any particular sample slot, such as just a kick or just a clap. And that opens up a whole new world in controlling the sounds of your samples. Now I know that we haven't covered effects yet, but like most things in this program, effects work by dragging and dropping them from the live devices area on the left onto the thing or the track that you want to affect. Note when we drag an effect onto Impulse, it's going to affect every single sample inside it. It works as kind of a global effect. So let's just listen to this sample here in Impulse dry, that is before the effect is applied. That's just something we've programmed in a previous tutorial. And then I'm going to go into Audio Effects and just drag onto that a simple delay. When we play it, we can hear that the whole track is affected by the delay. The kick, the snare, everything has a delay on it. The delay effect appears next to the impulse interface down the bottom, forming what we call a device chain. Now a device chain is really just a fancy name to explain the order that the sound travels through your track. In this case, the impulse and the simple delay are linked to like a chain by the sound running through them, and the device chain is running from left to right. We can even add a reverb here to this device chain just for fun. So it goes from left to right, impulse, delay, and then reverb. We can create a left to right device chain in Drum Rack too, just by adding a bunch of effects to the whole track. So I'll just drag on a few things here, and it's going to look roughly something like this. A reverb, a saturator, a simple delay, after the drum rack. And no matter which sample I double click on, the effect appears at the end of the device chain there. And it sounds something like this. With everything affected, a global effect. But what we can also do, which is way more fun, is to create a different device chain for every single sample. So I'll just delete these global ones from the whole track, so it's got no effects now, and I'm going to say put a reverb only on the kick. So I'll just drag a reverb there from the left, and I'll hover over the kick slot there very accurately. You can see a little orange border that appears, and I'll drop it. Now the reverb appears in the kick's device chain next to the kick, but when I click on the snare or the hat, there's no reverb. So let's have a listen. The reverb is only going to the kick. It sounds really roomy, but all of the other samples are still dry. What we can do now is add some distortion and delay to the snare and start to affect them differently. We can have a little peek at how and why this multiple device chain business is pretty cool. So here's a little picture that I've drawn to kind of explain how this device chain idea works. This is a global device chain, a left to right. We've got some MIDI notes going into a drum machine, through some effects, and then out onwards towards your master track. Something like Drum Rack, if you look a little closer, has a little bit more detail in it. So if we zoom into the drum machine, we can see there's more device chains there that we can play with. And as we zoom out, they all go through a master effects chain if you desire. So going on to the third difference, in Drum Rack, you're not only confined to drop drum samples into the sample slots, you can also drop synthesizers, samplers, or any sort of instrument that you want to be programmed. Like you could even drop a whole impulse drum machine if you wanted to. Okay, so we haven't looked at how to use any of these instruments, But let's just for fun create a copy of this track here, drum rack, and let's replace our beats with some of these crazy instruments. And straight up, just see how it sounds. I'm going to hold down Control and then drag and drop this track here to create a copy. And I'll just rename it so we don't get confused. And I'm just going to drag a few of these random instruments over where we'd previously put the drum samples to replace them. So if we just inspect these two MIDI tracks here, we can see they're still exactly the same. This one on the left is triggering our drum samples that we originally loaded, and this second drum rack on the right is triggering these crazy sounds. So let's give it a play, see how different it can be. And this is what it sounds like straight up. As you can imagine, there are a million different things that you can adjust and refine in each of these instruments if you want to, but we'll go into those later on. So the fourth difference is an area that you can get to by clicking this little picture here, and it opens up to the left of the drum rack areas. These 8 knobs have a fancy name called macros, and the basic idea is that you decide what they do. Because there are multiple device chains in drum rack and it can take a lot of clicking to get where you want to be, like I need to get to the snare's saturation, or no, take me back to the kick, I want to put a filter on that, or no, back to the snare because I realize that now the reverb's interacting weird with the kick. So you can kind of end up jumping back and forth so many times that this area here can be really helpful for shortcuts of things that you change often. All you need to do is decide what you want to access a lot, and then you can assign them to any one of these 8 knobs. For example, let's go into the kick and change the reverb size. I'm just going to right click or control click if you're on a Mac, assign to macro 1. If you go back to the macro, you can see that it's smart enough to have named it for you. If you want to name it something else that makes a little bit more sense to you, then like all renaming in Ableton Live, you just need to click on it, press Apple R if you're on a Mac or Control R in a PC, and then type in the name and press enter. We can do that for a couple more things here. And one thing that's worth mentioning about these macros is that a lot of people use them to play live gigs because they offer you the chance to choose what you want to play with. And they're a great tool for jamming or just coming up with creative ideas on the fly. If you're using a keyboard like the one in the studio that's got these 8 knobs up here, and many of the modern MIDI keyboards have these features, these 8 knobs often immediately correspond to the 8 macros in drum rack. So you can have something physical to kind of play around with. These 8 drum pads also correspond directly to this default area, where the slot area where you drag your drum samples into. So you can sort of drag them into the areas where the pads are triggering and have a great time playing those in live and mixing in effects with your macro knobs as well. That's it for our drum rack tutorial. Our next one is going to be on space-time, and it will be a basic introduction to musical timing in the Ableton workspace.